Professor M. Khusro is the present chairman of the National Institute of Finance and Policy and chairman, Agriculture Credit Review Officer, Bank of India. He's a well-known economist. He was professor of economics in Delhi University for 17 years, then Vice Chancellor Aligarh Muslim University. Earlier, he was ambassador to Federal Republic of Germany and also member of the Planning Commission, Government of India.
In any economy, there are two major systems working simultaneously, apart from some other systems. One is the macroeconomic demand-generating system, and the other is the supply-generating system. The demand-generating system has to do with the flow of money, and the supply-generating system obviously has to do with the flow of output. Now, these systems have to be understood, and in this session we shall deal with the first system, namely the demand-generating macroeconomic system. Here we note that if a citizen goes to the marketplace and spends something, then his expenditure, say on a pair of shoes, is equal to the number of pairs of shoes he bought, say 1, multiplied by the price he paid for it, say 150 rupees. If millions of citizens in 1 year's time, that is 1 year, went to the marketplace and spent on millions of things, it nevertheless remains true that the total national expenditure is equal to the output bought multiplied by the average price paid for that output. By one simple transposition, if we brought the O on the other side of the equation, surely it will go into the denominator, and we get the result that the average price level of a nation is a ratio between national expenditures, which is demand, and national output, which is supply. What is wrong in saying that price level is a ratio between demand and supply? Now, we split this national expenditure into its components, namely the consumption expenditure of the public, the private investment expenditure, that is expenditures by private businessmen on ordering durable equipment, goods which produce more goods, which are called investment goods, plus government expenditure of all kinds, including the 5-year plan expenditure, plus the balance of payments, exports minus imports, the thing in bracket. Now, that is the numerator, that is effective demand, that is national aggregate expenditure. We deal with that now. Later, we will come to the denominator. For the time being, we hold output constant. So if the general price level is rising, that must be because the expenditure in relation to output is rising, or some of the terms in the numerator here are rising faster than output, or are declining less fast than output. In order to understand this better, and dealing only with the numerator, that is national expenditures, we turn to this diagram, which is received macroeconomic theory. And here actually it's an Almara-like structure, a 3-dimensional diagram into which transparent plastic tubes and tanks are fitted. But here is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional model which shows the flow of money in the economy. Now, let us assume that the red liquid flowing into these tanks and flowing through these tubes is money. If we switch off the machine by gravity, all this money will be collected here. That's the total stock of money in the system. Now, people, agents of production, receive their incomes when they work in society for economic transactions, and they receive their incomes, and here is a pump installed in the machine which pushes up the red liquid, which is money here, and that money is supposed to be incomes received as wages, salaries, rents, interest, and profit. These are the earnings of society added together, that is the national income, and that in the hands of people after being received is used as expenditures. What expenditures? First, the public spends their incomes as consumption expenditure, which flows right here. It partly pays taxes to the government, which flows into the government budgetary tank, and it saves something over and above tax payments, and that flows into this liquidity tank, the private liquidity tank. Out of these savings received in the private tank, that is to say people's balances in their pockets and tills and bank deposits, Borrowers, that is businessmen, borrow and invest. And investment flows are shown here. Investment flows into this tube and is joined by consumption here. Out of the tax receipts of the government begins to spend something on various things, and G, that is government expenditure, flows here. Out of these three flows, consumption, government expenditure, and private investment, some payments are made to outside agents, outside the country, for the imports which we buy. We pay to them, and that is a leakage out payment from our system. But even as our citizens are importing goods and paying out, other countries' citizens are buying our exports and making payments to us, and here you are, the export receipts that our economy gets added here. So what have we got? Consumption plus government expenditure plus investment minus imports plus exports. All this is the receipts of the Indian economy of different firms and farms, etc. And that receipt is given away again to the agents of production as wages, salaries, rents, interest, and profits, and is again used by them in the next round. That is how money flows in the economy. Now, suppose we say that all was well and God was in heaven and all the streams were steady, consumption was there, government expenditure was equal to tax receipts, 100 rupees government expenditure, 100 billion rupees government expenditure, 100 billion rupees taxes, 50 billion rupees savings, 50 billion rupees private investment, imports 20 billion and exports 20 billion. If this was the situation, then the liquid will flow steadily without any change in the rate, and here is a cork floating on the liquid that is tied up to a pencil here, and the pencil is writing on a graph paper. The graph paper is moving leftwards at the rate of 1 inch per minute, so that the pencil is writing a steady straight line because of these three equalities: savings equal investment, taxation equals government expenditure, imports equal exports. If these three equalities hold, then the cork will be floating at a steady level. National income or national expenditure will be steady, meaning that price level will be steady if output was not changing, and we are assuming output constant in this discussion. These are the three conditions for price stability. These three equalities must hold. Now, starting with that position, we further notice that if saving is flowing in here and borrowers are borrowing and investing, then there is a cork flowing on this liquid here. That is the liquidity of the private sector. It is tied to a pointer, and the pointer is pointing out to the rate of interest in the economy. Now, if this saving is steady $20 billion rupees and this investment is 20 billion rupees, then this cork will be steady and the rate of interest at, shall we say, 8% will be constant. Now we see what changes take place as these inequalities do not hold. Now, obviously, it's a very difficult thing for a developing economy to hold these equalities. Imagine the state of a growing economy where you say the government shall not spend anything beyond tax receipts. Very difficult. That private borrowers and investors should not invest anything beyond the public's own remaining saving. Very difficult condition to hold. That imports from the country should be no more than exports. Also a very difficult condition. So in a developing economy, these inequalities may not hold. Suppose the government says we will now run a 5-year plan because the levels of income and per capita income and other provisions for health and nutrition and education are very low. We must develop the society, so they want to run a 5-year plan. They open this knob here, this aperture, and allow more funds to flow into government investment. So G increases. Cash balances of the government run down. How do they finance the 5-year plans? Well, it occurs to them to open the knob here and to collect more taxes. So they collect more taxes. Taxes may go up from 100 to 110. Government expenditure has gone up from 100 to 150 because that is the size of the plan, let us assume. Then how do they finance? Why can't they raise taxes further? Well, they can't, because taxation also has adverse effects on savings and on work and on effort, and therefore there is a limit to additional taxes. Having raised taxes to 10, well, what they say, we will borrow from the private sector and add to the government budget. And that is the government's borrowing program. Well, they borrow from private liquidity through this tube, which is connected to this government budget tank, and fill in some money in the budget, shall we say 20 billion. Well, that only raises the receipts of the government from 100 to 130. But of course, they increase the government expenditure to 150. How do they meet the additional expenditure? Well, there is a third source available to the government, borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India. Shall we assume that behind this graph there is a tank called the Reserve Bank of India, which can supply money through new notes, and the government borrows that money and puts it into the budget and spends that money as planned expenditure or anything else. Now, when they taxed more 10 billion rupees and spent more 10 billion rupees, surely the level of the budget was higher, but then the flows remain steady. That means tax-financed government expenditure is not inflationary. Money income will not increase, the cork will not float at any higher level, and price level will not change. So tax financing of the plan is not inflationary. If the government borrowed from the private saving tank, well, that also reduces, I suppose, some investment here, but it adds to government expenditures, still no change. On the other hand, there is a very important change we must note. And what is that? As the government withdraws private savings and puts it into the government budget through borrowings, the level of liquid in this tank will go down. And as that goes down, the cork will float at a lower level, which means that the pointer will point out to a higher rate of interest. The rate of interest in the market would then have increased, and that will depress private investment. Projects of the private sector, which could be financed at 8% interest, could not be financed at 12% interest, and therefore there will be a cut, presumably, in private investment, even as there is an increase in government investment or expenditure. So the government had better note that if it wants the private sector to be a partner in development, and some say equal partner, in that case that won't happen if interest rates are allowed to rise. Therefore, there is a device due to John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, who introduced, shall we say, conceptually in this tank, a moving plastic wall which can be shifted leftwards or shifted rightwards, and diminishing or enlarging the size of this liquidity tank. That is called liquidity preference. So suppose the government withdraws public saving, but at the same time psychologically playing upon the community's psychology, shifts this wall on this side and reduces the size of the tank, then there is no reason why the water should stand at a lower level. It will continue to stand at the higher level because the size of the tank is smaller, and that means the rate of interest will not change. Clever finance ministers, let us say Mr. C.G. Deshmukh, for instance, when they borrowed a lot of money from the private sector, they called meetings of the borrowers, the bankers, the investors, and said, what do you think should be the right level of borrowing? And by common consent, if he withdrew 150 crores and they agreed to that, that means their liquidity preference has diminished, the wall has shifted this side, the capacity of the tank has been reduced, interest rate need not fall, and interest rate will stand at the same old level. It will not depress private investment. So there is a theory of liquidity preference that we can understand. We can understand that the level of the rate of interest in the market depends partly on the saving flows per annum, partly on investment demand, and partly on the liquidity preference of the public. Now let us understand the inflation aspect of this diagram. When the government borrowed money from the private sector and spent it on government expenditures, then there would be no inflation, because while one flow is being augmented, another flow is being cut. When the government taxed the people and spent out of taxation, again there is not much inflation, because the government increase the flow of government expenditure through an increase in the flow of taxation. But this does point out to the situation that taxation in the aggregate are deflationary. If you tax more and did not spend more on government expenditure, then price level will tend to come down. But if, on the other hand, the government borrows from the Reserve Bank of India, then no diminution of any flow takes place anywhere, but on the other hand, increased flow of government expenditure comes from nowhere, that is from the Reserve Bank of India, and that is bound to be inflationary. That will increase the level of water here because the flows are bigger, and then the national income will rise, and the pointer will point a rising graph on this graph paper, meaning deficit financing generally is inflationary unless it is undertaken at a time when the output of the economy is rising. So no harm in raising government expenditure through deficit financing so long as simultaneously the agricultural and the industrial output of the economy is also rising. Now at this stage I would like to point out to this other diagram which I showed earlier, and I'd like to say that in the Indian economy an attempt was made in 1973 and many other times to evolve economic policy, particularly inflation control policy, in relation to the theory that one has just elaborated. You remember, some of you might, and if you look at the data you will find that in 1973 the price level in the country was rising at something like 23–24% per annum. Previous year it had risen by 20%, and the year before that it had risen by something like 18%, and we were moving into the Latin American zone of price increases. So the government and the people and the economists and policy makers were all very worried as to what to do, and therefore some important discussions took place at that time. For once reference was made to this theory, and the following things were done. In this situation, the government, the policy makers, the economists and other agents in society were all worried as to how to control the price level which was rising that fast. Policies were evolved at that time after a lot of discussion and with reference to good economic theory. What was done was, knowing that in 1973 September the Kharif crop was standing and it was a bad crop, and it had been followed by a bad Rabi, which had been followed by a bad Kharif, and the stocks of grain were very low. It was known that output would not increase. If output was not going to increase in the next 8 months horizon, then why not control effective demand, the numerator, fairly tightly, and policies were evolved for that purpose. For instance, many will remember that in 1974 the compulsory deposit scheme was mooted, I think by an ordinance, and the result was that the consumption expenditure of the public was not allowed to increase very much. Some of the earnings of people were mopped up and were put in their own accounts. They were not allowed to spend that. At the same time, the private businessman was told that he couldn't borrow very much from the Reserve Bank of India. There was a credit squeeze applied, and the bank rate was increased for the first time in India's history from 5% to 9%, and consequently all the other deposit rates rose up to 10 and 10.25%, and all the lending rates rose to between 14 and 18%. As a result of this, there was a tightening of the grip of money, and private businessmen could not borrow at that high rate of interest from any project. That was also the time when the central government's deficit financing was cut down very sharply, that G was sought to be reduced. That was also the time when the state governments were instructed not to borrow anything at all as overdrafts from the Reserve Bank of India. So state and central deficit financing taken together was seriously cut. The balance of payments was already negative. The items within the bracket were negative, and therefore when all the 4 items in the numerator began to become negative and come down, consumption, private investment, government expenditures, and the balance of payment, surely a positive effect was registered on the price level. And around March 1975, with a 15 months to 12 months time lag, the government was able to claim that the price level had become steady and inflation rate of something like 24% had been conquered. I would like to end up by giving a kind of prescription for stability, which would be as follows: either that the numerator could be allowed, effective demand could be allowed to increase, provided output in the economy is also increasing in that particular year and time. That is one way of stability. The second way of maintaining stability would be, again, looking to this other diagram. One notes that as it is difficult to keep all these three qualities, one can allow a deficiency of taxes compared to government expenditures and run a budget deficit. We can allow an excess of private investment over saving, and we can allow an imbalance in the balance of payments, provided we take care of these by substituting larger tax collection and a larger saving, particularly larger saving, large enough to finance the budget imbalance as well as the imbalance in the balance of payment. That would give a semblance of stability. Now, the final thing about stability would be that while one can try these policies on the monetary and the fiscal side, one also notes that the real clue to conquering inflation lies on the supply side in terms of increasing the rate of output, that is the rate of real growth of the economy. How to increase the rate of growth of the economy simultaneously with fiscal and monetary controls is a subject which belongs to the theory of planning, and how in a planned economy or a semi-planned economy forces could be released in order to augment output. That belongs to the presentation of the next session in this connection.